Was the move about getting away from the UK press because the press is, is everywhere, or was the move because you weren't getting enough support from the firm?
There's something striking about the idea that even the most experienced voices in media can have moments they later wish had unfolded differently, especially when those moments become defining points in their careers. Take Oprah Winfrey, for example, a figure whose reputation was built on trust, control, and an almost unmatched ability to understand the people sitting across from her, guiding conversations in ways that reveal far more than expected. And yet, despite that level of experience, this story doesn't begin on stage or in front of cameras, but somewhere far more private, away from the spotlight, where words are not shaped for an audience and carry a very different kind of weight. What has been circulating suggests that during one of those off-camera moments, a quiet remark was made about Meghan Markle, a sentence that may have seemed small at the time, but quickly became something much bigger. "I should have never trusted her." It's at that exact point that everything begins to shift, because statements like that, even when spoken in confidence, have a way of moving beyond the room they were said in, spreading through conversations and networks where information rarely stays hidden for long.
What has been noticed now from that clip is you can actually see from sort of a more of a bird's eye view the Queen with the blanket on her legs in the car on that day. And it's a little difficult to make out very clearly, but it does look like the Queen only put the blanket on her own lap. And again, it seems like a small detail, but it does speak to the relationship.
What started as a private reflection didn't remain contained. Instead, it expanded into a growing wave of speculation that moved quickly through Hollywood, turning into a situation that few could have predicted, and even fewer were prepared for. This time, the focus shifts to something far more layered, a question that has been building quietly for years. What exactly has Oprah Winfrey been holding back? And why does it feel like those details are only now beginning to surface in a more serious way? For nearly 3 years, one thing stood out more than anything else: her silence when it came to Meghan Markle. There were no red carpet remarks, no follow-up interviews, not even those relaxed, off-the-record conversations where public figures usually allow themselves to speak a little more freely, and that absence of commentary didn't go unnoticed, because in situations like this, silence often carries more meaning than words. It becomes even more significant when you remember how it all began, with Oprah welcoming Meghan into her Montecito home, creating a setting that felt personal, controlled, and incredibly powerful in terms of reach, offering her a global platform where she could speak openly without the usual limitations that come with high-profile interviews. There was no visible time pressure, no aggressive questioning, and no sense of resistance from the production side, allowing Meghan to express herself emotionally, to present her perspective in full, and to reshape her narrative in front of millions of viewers around the world.
She told a story later in her Oprah Winfrey interview in 2021 where she talked about the moment that the Queen was more like a grandma to her, because she saw that Meghan may have been cold and put a blanket over her legs as well. And it was it's a small detail and it's a smallish story, but it had significance because it showed the relationship that Meghan had with the Queen.
At the time, the moment was widely described as historic, something that went beyond a typical interview and entered the space of cultural impact. A turning point that influenced conversations across media, public opinion, and the way royal stories were discussed on a global scale. Even though the interview appeared polished and carefully controlled on the surface, there were already subtle signs that everything might not have been as aligned as it seemed, and some insiders reportedly picked up on that early, noticing small inconsistencies that didn't quite fit together the way they were expected to. At the time, those observations stayed quiet, more like background whispers than anything public, but they didn't disappear. And over time, they started to carry more weight, especially as new discussions began to surface around late July, bringing those early doubts back into focus and making them feel far more relevant than they once did. According to accounts connected to the production, Oprah Winfrey may have begun questioning things almost immediately after filming Wrapped, despite having initially offered Meghan Markle and Prince Harry a platform to share their perspective openly. What reportedly stood out wasn't necessarily what was said on camera, but what happened beyond it, moments that weren't part of the final broadcast, yet left a different kind of impression. One that, according to those claims, created a sense of unease that wasn't visible to the audience watching from the outside. In the days that followed the broadcast, the tone behind the scenes was already starting to shift. And according to claims that later surfaced, someone connected to Oprah Winfrey's inner circle suggested that her reaction privately may have been far more critical than anything seen publicly.
Do this for my family. This is not a surprise to anybody. It's really sad that it's got to this point, but I've got to do something for my own mental health, my wife's. and for Archie's as well, because I could see
It was alleged that in those early conversations, she expressed concern about the nature of the interview itself, describing it less as traditional journalism and more as something that had taken on a different direction once the platform had been given, a moment where control may have shifted in ways that weren't fully anticipated. Soon after, attention began turning toward details within the interview, with various commentators and analysts pointing out inconsistencies that raised additional questions, while separate reports and background information started to surface, adding layers that complicated the original narrative and made the situation far less straightforward than it initially appeared. Public reaction followed that shift quickly, with opinions moving back and forth as people reassessed what they had seen, some continuing to support every claim, while others began looking at the interview from a more critical perspective. Through all of this, one thing remained consistent: Oprah's silence. And that silence didn't feel accidental. It came across as measured, almost intentional, especially given her reputation for addressing major moments directly when she chooses to. According to those familiar with the situation, concerns may have started forming almost immediately after filming ended, building gradually over time, rather than appearing all at once. At first glance, it might seem like a story that ends there, a high-risk interview followed by quiet reflection, but in reality, that was only the beginning of something much more complex. What happened next is where the situation takes on a very different tone, because it no longer felt like just another controversy surrounding Meghan Markle. It became something that, according to reports, may have affected Oprah Winfrey on a more personal level. What many viewers didn't immediately pick up on during the broadcast were the small, almost unnoticeable shifts in Oprah's behavior, the slight hesitations before certain responses.
Him to be a prince or a princess, not knowing what the gender would be, which would be different from protocol, and that he wasn't going to receive security.
what?
The longer pauses she allowed to linger, moments that at first seemed like part of her usual thoughtful interview style. But looking back, some insiders now suggest those pauses may have carried a different meaning, not just space for reflection, but subtle signs of uncertainty forming in real time, as if certain details weren't aligning as smoothly as expected. And according to those same accounts, much of that tension traces back to a moment that seemed completely harmless to millions watching at home. A quiet scene set around Meghan's chicken coop, presented as simple, rustic, and personal, with its modest fencing and carefully framed atmosphere. At the time, it came across as a light, almost symbolic moment, but in hindsight, some believe it may have been one of the first instances where questions quietly began to surface beneath the surface of the interview itself. What seemed like one of the most ordinary and relatable moments in the entire interview may have carried far more weight behind the scenes than anyone realized at the time, because that quiet segment involving Archie's chickens, presented as simple, natural, and authentic, is now being pointed to as a turning point in how the interview was perceived internally.
Someone with a sharp set of eyes has noticed perhaps a mistruth in the Oprah interview. Here it is.
On screen, the setting felt warm and carefully grounded, a rustic coop, soft visuals, and a tone that suggested everyday simplicity. But according to reports that later circulated, there were claims that parts of that setup may have been adjusted shortly before filming, which, if true, could have changed how the moment was interpreted. According to one account linked to a former CBS-affiliated editor, Oprah Winfrey reportedly reviewed the final cut of the interview more than once in the days leading up to its release. And while the first viewing was said to be quiet and reflective, the second reportedly raised more questions, with concerns beginning to form about how certain elements might be received over time. It was during that stage, according to those claims, that she is said to have expressed a sense of unease, suggesting that some parts of the interview might not hold up as expected in the long run. And what makes that detail stand out is that it wasn't the major revelations or the more serious allegations that were said to trigger that reaction, but rather a smaller, more subtle moment, one that appeared designed to present Meghan Markle and Prince Harry in a relatable, grounded way, connecting them to a simpler image that resonated strongly with viewers at the time.
I was really ashamed to say it at the time, and ashamed to have to admit it to Harry, especially, because I know how much loss he's suffered. But I knew that if I didn't say it, that I would do it, and I just didn't want to be alive. And
what initially seemed like a simple detail began to take on a very different meaning once additional claims started circulating about how that scene may have been prepared, because if the setup had indeed been recently arranged or adjusted, it would naturally raise questions about how that moment was intended to be perceived. According to reports tied to people familiar with the production, that realization is what may have led Oprah Winfrey to view certain parts of the interview differently, not as spontaneous or purely organic, but as something more carefully structured, something that carried intention beyond what was immediately visible. It was in that context, according to those same accounts, that concerns began to form around the idea of control versus transparency, a distinction that can significantly shape how an interview is understood once it reaches the public. But even that was not the moment insiders describe as the most surprising. What reportedly happened after filming, Wrapped added another layer entirely. As the production team began packing equipment and the set started to wind down, one account suggests that Meghan Markle approached a member of the staff privately with a request, not related to the usual post-production formalities, but specifically asking about access to the final edit. That request, according to the report, stood out immediately, as editorial control is typically kept separate in productions of that scale, especially under Oprah's framework. The message was then passed up through the production chain, eventually reaching Oprah herself, and according to those same claims, her response was direct and firm, maintaining clear boundaries over how the final version of the interview would be handled.
She has a blanket that sits across her knees for warmth, and it was chilly. And she was like, Meghan, come on, and put it over my knees as well.
According to those same accounts, the response that came back made one thing very clear. The platform belonged to Oprah Winfrey, and the editorial control around it was not something she was willing to share or negotiate, regardless of who the guest was or how significant the interview might be. What reportedly stood out even more was that the situation didn't end with that initial exchange, because later that same evening, there were claims that a follow-up request was made through an intermediary, this time suggesting that the final version of the interview should reflect what was described as her truth, a phrase often used in personal storytelling, but one that, in this context, may have carried a different implication. For someone like Oprah, whose reputation has been built over decades on presenting conversations as authentic, direct, and free from visible influence, that kind of framing is said to have created a level of discomfort, not because of the wording itself, but because of what it might suggest about how the interview was being positioned behind the scenes. According to insiders referenced in those reports, that moment is where a shift may have begun, a gradual change in perception, where what was initially seen as a defining, open conversation started to feel more structured than expected. From that point on, it suggested that trust didn't disappear instantly, but began to fade, leading to a quieter, more measured distance forming between Meghan Markle and Oprah in the time that followed. Not long after the interview aired, another moment reportedly added a new layer to the situation, this time involving someone Oprah Winfrey has trusted for years, her close friend Gayle King. As public reactions were building across social media, Oprah is said to have received a message from Gayle that immediately stood out. The wording was brief but pointed, suggesting that there was more happening behind the scenes than what had been publicly discussed, which naturally raised questions about what exactly she meant.
So this was Meghan's very first outing with the Queen. It happened right after her wedding to Prince Harry, and it was obviously extremely important and a significant occasion because it was her first outing.
At first, it was reportedly interpreted as a reference to internal conversations, possibly involving production or network dynamics. But that interpretation shifted when a follow-up message added more context, indicating that a similar concept had been shared elsewhere in a way that felt unexpectedly familiar. According to accounts linked to that exchange, the idea being referenced was described as a documentary-style project, structured around a multi-part narrative focusing on Meghan Markle's life after stepping away from royal duties, including themes such as motherhood, philanthropy, and personal reinvention. What reportedly made that moment more significant was the suggestion that a similar concept had already been discussed previously, creating a sense of overlap that hadn't been anticipated at the time. From that perspective, it introduced a different way of looking at the situation, not necessarily as a single interview, but as part of a broader narrative strategy, something that, according to those claims, led Oprah to reassess how the entire project had unfolded behind the scenes. From that point forward, the situation is said to have shifted into something much more personal for Oprah Winfrey, no longer just a professional collaboration that didn't unfold as expected, but something that raised deeper questions about trust and perception, especially given how much she had invested in creating a space where the story could be told openly. According to those same reports, the feeling wasn't immediate, but something that developed over time as more details and perspectives began to surface, gradually changing how the entire experience was viewed in hindsight, almost like revisiting a moment with new information that alters its meaning. What's described as the most unexpected part came from within the production environment itself, not from public commentary or external criticism, but from someone who had been directly involved behind the scenes, a stylist who reportedly worked closely with Meghan Markle during the final wardrobe preparations for the interview. The account, which was said to have been shared discreetly without any attempt to seek attention or publicity, described a contrast that stood out, noting that on camera, everything appeared composed, warm, and effortless. with Meghan presenting herself in a way that aligned perfectly with the tone of the interview. But according to that perspective, the difference between what was visible during filming and what may have been happening outside of those moments added another layer to the overall narrative, contributing to the growing sense that the situation was more complex than it initially appeared. According to that same account, the contrast became more noticeable the moment filming paused and the atmosphere shifted away from the cameras when the production energy dropped and the team moved back into the holding area. It was there, the stylist claimed, that Meghan Markle's tone appeared to change, moving from the composed, emotional presence seen on screen to something more analytical, as if the interview was being discussed not just as a personal moment, but as a carefully managed exchange. What stood out in that description was the suggestion that the interview itself was framed in terms of mutual value, with the idea that Oprah Winfrey brought credibility, while Meghan brought the narrative, a perspective that, if interpreted that way, could shift how the interaction is understood. The stylist also claimed that there were remarks made about how emotional pacing during the interview influenced its direction, suggesting that pauses and expressions could shape how the conversation unfolded, something that, from an outside perspective, would directly contrast with the expectation of spontaneous, unfiltered dialogue. For someone like Oprah, whose career has been built on creating spaces for genuine conversation and emotional honesty, that kind of interpretation, if taken seriously, would naturally carry significant weight. And according to the same chain of reports, the situation didn't end there, because another element reportedly emerged from a different direction entirely, involving someone connected to Prince Harry's inner circle, who is said to have attempted to raise concerns even before the interview took place, adding yet another layer to a story that continued to grow more complex over time. The message itself was said to be brief, respectful, but impossible to ignore in tone, a quiet warning that carried more weight the longer it was considered. According to reports, it read along the lines of caution, suggesting that what was being presented as truth might not be as straightforward as it seemed, and that Oprah Winfrey should approach the situation carefully before moving forward with filming. At the time, it's believed that Oprah did not treat the message as a reason to stop the process, as she had already prepared extensively, conducted research, and committed to what would become one of the most widely discussed interviews of that period. A vague warning, especially from outside official channels, may not have seemed enough to change that course. However, as additional claims and accounts began to surface afterward, including the reported conversation involving Gayle King and the stylist's perspective from behind the scenes, those earlier moments started to take on a different meaning in hindsight. According to those same reports, Oprah later shared a private reflection with members of her inner circle, expressing the view that more questions could have been asked, not with the intention of challenging for the sake of conflict, but to ensure clarity and balance within the conversation. That reflection, as it's described, marked a shift in how the entire experience was being processed, moving from a single moment of uncertainty into something more layered, a growing sense of reconsideration about how the interview unfolded and what may have been missed along the way. And just as that reassessment was taking shape, another piece of information is said to have surfaced, adding further complexity and pushing the situation into an even more intense phase. In the period following the broadcast, another development is said to have added even more tension to the situation, as reports began circulating that Meghan Markle's team had quietly started exploring the possibility of a second major tell-all, a new platform, another round of revelations, and another moment designed to capture global attention. According to those same accounts, what made this particularly striking was the suggestion that the original interview may have been seen not as a final statement, but as part of a broader sequence, a first step in a longer narrative that could continue to unfold. Insiders claim that within those early discussions, there was phrasing that stood out, implying that the previous interview had not been considered sufficient on its own, a detail that, if interpreted that way, could significantly shift how the entire situation is viewed. For Oprah Winfrey, whose career has been built on trust, depth, and the ability to create defining moments in media, that perspective is said to have landed differently, introducing the possibility that her role may have been part of a larger strategy rather than a standalone collaboration. From that point of view, the realization would not simply be about disappointment, but about reassessing how the interaction had been positioned, moving from a shared platform for storytelling into something that may have carried additional intent behind the scenes. And according to those reports, it was shortly after that realization began to settle in that Oprah made a decisive move, reaching out not publicly and not to the individuals involved, but directly to her longtime executive producer, signaling that the situation had entered a much more serious phase. According to those same reports, the tone of that call stood out more than anything else, described as calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm, the kind of clarity that leaves little room for interpretation. It wasn't emotional, it wasn't reactive, it was deliberate, suggesting that a line had been drawn after everything that had unfolded. What followed, as it's been described, was a clear internal decision, one that signaled a shift in direction rather than a public confrontation, reflecting how Oprah Winfrey typically handles moments of significance, not through immediate statements, but through quiet changes that carry long-term impact. When questions reportedly arose about what had led to that point, the explanation, according to those same sources, centered around the idea of expectations versus outcome. The belief that the platform had been offered in good faith with the intention of creating space for openness, while what emerged may have felt more structured than anticipated. From that perspective, the distinction between authenticity and presentation became central, not as a public accusation, but as a private reassessment of how the interview had been experienced behind the scenes. And from that moment forward, the shift wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come through headlines or direct statements, but instead unfolded in a much quieter way, through distance, through absence, and through the kind of subtle changes that, over time, begin to reshape how relationships and narratives are understood. Rather than unfolding through public statements or direct criticism, the shift is said to have appeared in a way that often carries even more weight within the entertainment industry, through silence, the kind that doesn't need explanation because its meaning is understood without being spoken. According to those same accounts, the change became noticeable over time, with fewer invitations, slower responses from PR teams, and a general sense that certain doors were no longer opening as easily as before, not through rejection, but through quiet distance. One insider connected to a major streaming platform reportedly described the situation in simple terms, suggesting that when Oprah Winfrey steps back, others tend to take notice, not necessarily out of obligation, but because her influence within the industry carries long-standing credibility. For Meghan Markle, this didn't result in open criticism or direct pushback, but rather a shift in tone, where the initial enthusiasm that once surrounded her presence began to cool, replaced by a more cautious approach. And in many ways, that kind of response can have a deeper impact than public disagreement, because it reflects how perception changes behind the scenes, where decisions are often made without needing to be announced. According to those same reports, one of the moments that highlighted this shift most clearly came during a high-profile charity event weeks later, where expectations around presence and reception often play a key role in shaping how someone is viewed within those circles. At that event, the shift in atmosphere is said to have been difficult to miss, even though everything on the surface still followed the expected flow of a high-profile evening. Meghan Markle arrived as anticipated, composed and confident, moving through the VIP space with the same presence that had once drawn consistent attention. However, according to those accounts, the response around her felt different, more restrained, less engaged, not openly negative, but noticeably distant in a way that stood out to those observing closely. Interactions that would typically feel natural appeared more limited, with some individuals choosing not to engage as directly as expected. One of the moments that has been highlighted in those reports involved the seating arrangement, where an empty place at her table became a focal point of discussion. The seat had reportedly been assigned to Viola Davis, but she did not attend, and according to those same accounts, alternative arrangements had been made prior to the event. While details like that can be interpreted in different ways, within the context of the broader narrative, they contributed to a growing perception that something had shifted behind the scenes. What had once been quieter conversations began, according to those reports, to surface more openly, gradually influencing how she was viewed within certain circles. And rather than being defined by one single moment, it reflected a broader transition, a gradual change in tone that continued to develop in the weeks following that event. According to those same reports, efforts were made in the weeks that followed to stabilize the situation, with Meghan Markle reportedly reaching out through established channels, including mutual contacts, publicists, and individuals connected to Oprah Winfrey's wider professional circle, in what appeared to be an attempt to re-establish communication and restore some level of alignment. The approach, as it has been described, was measured and indirect, relying on the kind of quiet outreach that typically takes place behind the scenes in the industry, where relationships are often managed without public visibility. However, according to insiders cited in those accounts, the responses were limited, with some contacts remaining distant and others choosing not to engage at all, reinforcing the sense that a shift had already taken place. One particular detail that has been referenced involves a message reportedly passed along through a mutual connection, described as brief but definitive in tone, emphasizing the idea that once trust is compromised, rebuilding it becomes significantly more difficult. For Meghan, the impact of that response, if interpreted that way, would not necessarily come from public reaction, something she had already experienced at various points, but from a change within the professional network itself, where access, perception, and opportunity are closely tied to long-standing relationships, And according to those same reports, that is where the situation began to feel more tangible, as the narrative moved beyond external criticism into a shift within the circles that had once been seen as familiar and accessible. For Meghan Markle, the situation is described as a moment where perception and reality may have started to diverge, especially in an environment like Hollywood, where influence isn't sustained by visibility alone, but by trust, timing, and the strength of long-term alliances. According to those same reports, once those alliances begin to shift, the impact can be felt quickly, not always through public reaction, but through changes in access, communication, and overall momentum, making recovery far more complex than it might appear from the outside. In response, it is said that Meghan began leaning more heavily on her immediate circle, particularly Prince Harry, as they worked together to reassess their position and consider what direction to take next. At the same time, reports suggest that within their professional teams, the atmosphere had started to change, with increased focus on managing perception rather than expanding opportunities, described by one former consultant as a period where strategy became centered on navigating existing challenges rather than building new momentum. Meanwhile, Oprah Winfrey maintained complete public silence, and that absence of commentary continued to carry weight, particularly within an industry that closely watches not only who she supports, but also who she chooses to distance herself from. As one industry perspective has framed it, those kinds of signals rarely need to be explained directly, because they are often understood through implication, and it's within that space that the situation is said to have grown more complex, adding another layer to an already evolving narrative. According to those same accounts, developments that had once seemed almost certain began to lose momentum in subtle but noticeable ways, with partnerships slowing down, meetings being postponed, and negotiations that had initially shown promise gradually losing traction. None of these changes were significant enough on their own to draw public attention, but when viewed together, they began to form a pattern that insiders found difficult to overlook, suggesting a shift that was happening quietly rather than through any single defining moment. From the perspective of Meghan Markle, the situation is described as increasingly frustrating, especially given that she had followed a path often encouraged in modern media, sharing her personal story, building a recognizable brand, and maintaining a strong level of public visibility. What may not have been fully anticipated, according to those reports, was how quickly perception can change once influential figures within the industry begin to feel uncertain, as that kind of hesitation tends to ripple outward in ways that are not always immediately visible. Hollywood, while open to reinvention, often places a strong emphasis on consistency and predictability, and when those elements appear less certain, responses can shift accordingly. One insider claimed that Meghan expressed that frustration privately, reflecting on the expectation that openness and honesty would be met with support, while the reaction she encountered behind the scenes suggested a far more complex reality, where perception, trust, and timing all play a role in shaping outcomes. According to those same reports, the issue was never described as being about the story itself, but rather about the way it was presented and managed, a distinction that may seem subtle on the surface, yet carries significant weight in an industry where perception often shapes reality. By this stage, the situation had clearly moved beyond a single interview or any one disagreement, evolving instead into a broader shift in reputation, the kind that develops quietly through private conversations, internal messages, and discussions that take place behind closed doors rather than in public view. Once a narrative of that kind begins to circulate within Hollywood networks, it becomes increasingly difficult to control, let alone reverse, because it spreads through influence rather than headlines, and by the time it becomes noticeable, it is often already established. For Meghan Markle, what may not have been immediately clear, according to those accounts, was that a larger challenge was beginning to form, one that could extend beyond short-term reactions and start affecting long-term positioning within the industry. At the same time, the distance reportedly created by Oprah Winfrey did not remain a purely personal matter, but instead became part of a wider shift in how certain circles began to respond, influencing perception in ways that are rarely stated openly, but often understood internally. What had once appeared to be a steady progression from royal life to major media opportunities, from stepping away from the monarchy to establishing a new presence in Montecito, is said to have slowed in a way that was noticeable to those watching closely. And perhaps the most striking part of that shift is that it was not driven by a single scandal or a defining headline, but by something far more subtle, a change in perception that, once it takes hold, becomes significantly harder to address or undo. What made this shift especially striking is that it didn't arrive with noise or dramatic headlines, but in a form that Hollywood often treats as even more serious, a gradual slide toward irrelevance, where momentum slows not through rejection, but through absence. According to those same reports, public relations firms that had once been eager to collaborate with Meghan Markle began to reconsider their involvement, while studios that had previously expressed interest quietly stopped advancing conversations, and streaming platforms that once anticipated future projects started placing ideas on hold. Nothing was officially canceled, and no single announcement marked the change. But taken together, the pattern became increasingly clear to those watching from within the industry. Insiders repeatedly pointed to one underlying factor: the influence of Oprah Winfrey, and the reality that when someone with that level of credibility begins to step back, it rarely goes unnoticed. Hollywood, as many describe it, doesn't simply respond to trends, it responds to power, and shifts in trust often carry consequences that extend far beyond one relationship. For Meghan, the impact is said to have gone deeper than public criticism ever could, because this wasn't something that played out through headlines or interviews, but through subtle signals, unanswered messages, delayed meetings, and opportunities that gradually disappeared without explanation. That kind of response is particularly difficult to address because it offers no direct point of confrontation, no single claim to respond to, only a growing sense of distance that becomes harder to close over time. Even among those who had previously been supportive, there were reports of a more cautious approach, not necessarily a reversal of opinion, but a shift toward careful alignment, especially as internal conversations began to frame her as highly strategic in how narratives were managed. At the same time, it's said that Meghan made efforts to understand and respond to the situation, reaching out through shared contacts, exploring new directions, and continuing to speak positively about Oprah in public, but according to insiders, those efforts did not significantly alter the outcome. The response, as it's been described, remained consistent, defined by distance, silence, and limited engagement. And in many ways, that is where the deeper reality of the situation becomes clearer, because this was never only about one individual, but about how the industry itself operates, where alignment with trusted figures plays a central role, and where a shift in that alignment can quietly reshape opportunities without ever needing to be announced. In the end, what appears to have carried the greatest impact wasn't any single headline or public reaction, but the continued silence from Oprah Winfrey, a silence that, within entertainment circles, is often interpreted as something far more definitive than words themselves. At that level of influence, silence can function almost like a final decision, one that doesn't need to be formally announced to be understood, because when a figure of that stature is believed to have reached a certain conclusion, whether spoken publicly or not, people within the industry tend to take notice, and more importantly, they tend to remember. For Meghan Markle, the situation is described not as a traditional scandal, but as something more difficult to confront, a gradual shift in influence, where momentum slows and perception begins to change in ways that are not always visible from the outside. In an industry built on relationships, timing, and trust, even a single connection weakening can create ripple effects, quietly altering opportunities that once seemed stable and widely accessible. And that may be what makes this story stand out. Not the noise around it, but the way it unfolds beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without ever needing to be stated directly. If you've been following this closely, share your thoughts below. And if this perspective gave you something new to consider, stay tuned for more deep dives like this. This is Palace Loop.